What's up, Grandmaster Igor Smirnov is here, and today I'm going to address perhaps the most common question that students ask me is, Igor, what is the best chess opening for black against white's first move pawn e4? And I'm going to share with you an opening that my students had lots of successes with, which is the French defense. And I'm going to explain in a moment why this is so successful for black and how you should utilize it properly. And I'm going to slow down and explain the reason behind every move so that you don't have to memorize these variations, but you really understand them deeply, better than most of your opponents, and that you are ready to play the French defense, which is very suitable for beginners, but it's going to serve you all the way up till you become a grandmaster, the world champion, the universe champion, whatever. It's a really universal opening. One of the good reasons to play the French defense, especially for beginners, is that you instantaneously cover the weakest point of your position, that f7 pawn, which is the door to the residency of your king. Because instead, if you play pawn e5, the most common move, that one has lots of various kinds of attack against this pawn instantaneously or later in the game. They've got bishop c4, the Italian game, the bishop's opening, the king's gambit, where they also target the same weakness long term, different kinds of scholars checkmate threats or fried liver attacks where they add the knight to attack this pawn. And there are so many tricks that you got to be careful with, that sometimes you can just go down badly if your opponent knows all those tricks. With the French defense, that's just not the case. You close the door to your king instantaneously. There are no checkmates that are possible in any near future. You aren't gonna face any quick attack against you, that's for sure. Moreover, on the next move after pawn d4 and pawn d5, you completely solidify this diagonal. So for sure there is no bishop c4 and there is no attack along this diagonal in this game. And that's one great advantage of the French defense. The other one is that if you look at the database, you'll see that pros usually in this case play the most principled move, which is knight to c3, or sometimes knight to d2, which is also pretty good. But amateurs are usually frightened of the extensive theory of those variations, and instead of the most principled moves, they very often opt for a simpler move, pawn e5, which indeed makes white's life simpler, but it's also less aggressive and gives you a clear attacking plan for the middle game, which makes it easier for black to play it. And so we're going to start off with this variation in particular, because that's what is the most common approach of white against the French defense, and later I'll tell you what to do against other moves as well. But for now, let's start with this most common move, pawn e5. Now, in general, what's the white's plan and what is the black's plan here? The upside of this pawn e5 advancement, of this advanced variation, is that this pawn got into your territory and now it takes away these two squares, so that, for example, you cannot develop your knight normally, which is somewhat uncomfortable for black. But there is a price for that. White is stretching out their position a little too much, and by putting these pawns further away from the rest of their army, they make them more vulnerable to your attack, because they're closer to your position, to black's position, and so it's easier for you to attack them, harder for white to defend. And that's going to be your long-term plan, to attack these two pawns. We cannot really attack the e5 pawn here because it's already defended, and for that reason we do attack this pawn on d4, and we do this instantaneously with the move pawn to c5. We do want to break down these pawns and to capture them one by one. That's our plan. White does not want that, so they do play pawn to c3, and you play knight c6, putting more pressure into these both pawns, primarily into the pawn on d4. And you're going to simply keep developing your pieces and keep attacking that pawn. Again, the simplicity of your plan is another great advantage of the French defense. Now, in this position, let me also cover different moves, not only the moves that are played by top grandmasters, but also the moves that are commonly played by players of 1200, 1500, 1700 rated or so, okay? One of those moves, which are common on this amateur level, is the move pawn to f4. White understands that you are targeting their pawn chain in the middle of the board, and they want to strengthen it. But actually, this is wrong, and it just kind of stretches the white's position further without enough support, and it makes it even easier for you to attack it. So after pawn to f4, what we do here is we play queen to b6, attacking this pawn for the third time, and now this is a real threat. We are going to capture the pawn if white doesn't defend it, therefore white needs to defend it, so knight f3 is played. And now you're thinking, okay, how do I attack this pawn once again? And there is a very common maneuver where you bring your knight from g8 to f5, either through the e7 square or through the h6 square. Both maneuvers are equally good. Here we can go knight h6, knight f5, and put more pressure onto this pawn and ultimately capture it. One question you may be wondering is like, okay, if that pawn is a problem for white, what if white simply trades it off? Well, that solves the problem of this pawn, but of course, it's still pretty good for black, because first of all, you develop your bishop with a tempo. Secondly, you do control this diagonal, which potentially attacks white's king, where we were threatening, for example, something like bishop f2 check. White cannot castle anymore in this game. You are ready to bring your knight to the attack as well for something like g4 and then f2. Therefore, that definitely doesn't solve all of white's problems. Let's take it back. Instead, white usually tries to maintain this pawn and somehow to defend it. How do they do it? One of the common blunders of white is just playing some developing moves, something like bishop e2. Looks like there is just nothing wrong with this move, and yet you're going to win lots of games with the very simple maneuver. You're going to take here, and after an exchange you do play knight to f5, and you attack this pawn 3 times, white defends it twice, and there is nothing white can do to defend it further. So on the next move you're going to take it. Again, this also opens up this diagonal after you capture the pawn, and white's in trouble. White cannot, of course, defend it with the bishop over here, because you simply win the bishop. So that's one way for you to win lots of games easily. If your opponent is more experienced, he's likely to play bishop to d3, which is the right approach for white. Because from here, it does control this square f5. So if you land your knight there, white can at least exchange it. There's no problem for you, by the way, if that exchange happens. You're quite happy to have 2 bishops advantage, but at least white maintains their position and they don't lose a pawn. At this point, you may be wondering, hey, but that blocks white's queen. So what if we just win this pawn? Can't we win this pawn on d4? That's actually one of the most common traps in the French defense that you gotta be aware of. You cannot win this pawn immediately, because if you do that, if you try to trade everything on d4, then yes, for a second you win a pawn, but white has a very common bishop b5 discover check tactics that helps them to just win your queen. So definitely you don't want to go here. However, it doesn't mean anything changes in your plan. You just need to prepare it a little bit. And so if this diagonal is weak, you've got a very simple move, bishop to d7, which covers your king along this diagonal. And now the threat to the d4 pawn is real. You aren't going to capture it on the next move. White has to deal with it once again. And for that reason, they play bishop c2, so that their queen is active and is defending this pawn once again. And now there are different ways to go about this. I like a little tricky move, rook to c8, which puts your rook in an ambush. And white usually castles here, because what else can white do? And if they do castle, you've got a really shocking combo here. It starts off with this exchange on d4. Usually, at some point, you do trade there, because then this pawn on d4 becomes real weak, and you already capture it. And at this point, we can see the point of putting our rook to c8, because now this c-file is open and our rook is active. One common way for you to take advantage of this would be to co-play knight b4. Very often it's a good move for black, as in this position, just as well. We're hitting the bishop. This is uncomfortable. By the way, if you can exchange an opponent's bishop for your knight, this is good overall, because the bishop is a little bit stronger than a knight. And in the French defense in particular, because this bishop is active, like the dark square bishop of white is passive, light square bishop is active. If you can trade it off, that's great. But in this particular case, besides knight to b4, you've got an even stronger option, which is also worth remembering. It's common tactics here. It is knight takes d4. You temporarily sacrifice your knight because you come on top at the end of the line. White can take it with either queen or knight, but both cases are pretty bad. Queen takes d4 loses instantaneously. I mean, first of all, this bishop is hanging, but even stronger is to play bishop c5 and to win the queen because it's pinned down to the king. So that's completely bad for white. Let's take it back. It is stronger for white to take it with the knight, but then bishop comes over here to c5, and you can see that white's position is shaky overall. This knight is pinned, it's also attacked, you have this rook putting pressure along the c-file. The only way to defend the knight is playing bishop e3, but that weakens this pawn on b2, and now you capture that pawn, which also threatens this rook on a1. The only way to defend the rook would be knight to d2, but now this d4 knight is lost, bishop takes d4. It's nice how your position really rolls out onto white, and you start just capturing everything. Bishop takes d4, hits this bishop as well. If bishop takes, queen takes d4, check to the king has to go. Now there is another common move which is worth remembering. One of the common problems of black in the French defense is a bad bishop on d7 the light square bishop because it's restricted by its own pawn chain. And therefore, whenever you can bring this bishop out of the pawn chain to an empty space, so to say, that's usually a great idea to do. And here you can play bishop b5, relocating your bishop to a much more active diagonal and attacking the rook. The rook has to defend this pawn, so let's say something like rook f3 is played, and now you have another nice tactics, bishop e2, attacking the queen and deflecting it from the defense of this rook on a1. Now we capture the rook with a check to the king. Oops, somehow I can't make this arrow, let me try again. Yeah, delivering check to the king, and our rook is active along the c file, hitting this bishop, and it's interesting how after white's pawn on d4, fallen, white's entire position collapsed and you started to capture like everything at every turn, and you just destroyed the white's position completely. Let's come back to the starting position of this variation and let's see what else your opponents can try against you and how are you going to deal with it. White may try also here playing bishop to b5 because white realizes that you're going to put pressure onto these pawns, so why not to develop a bishop and to pin this annoying knight. In this case, you do play a bishop d7. It's a very simple solution to the pin, and there is a very usual tactics. If white here plays virtually any move, for example, knight f3, or again, virtually any move, you have a very sudden tactics, knight takes e5, and you just win a pawn. What's the trick? Well, you open up this attack. So if white takes here, you take the bishop, and you win a pawn along the way, that pawn on e5. And if white instead tries taking here, then your knight sneaks back to d7 with that extra pawn on e5 that we grabbed, which just gives you a material advantage with no compensation for white, so that already gives you a winning position. There is also one trap that more experienced opponents may try against you. Here we do know that you are threatening knight takes e5, and so a more experienced player will take here on c6 probably, you do recapture, and now they play knight to f3. And the position overall is okay. By the way, it's great for you that this exchange occurred. Now, white doesn't have their light square bishop, which is a key piece overall in the white's middle game attack. Because imagine the middle game position where you castle kingside. If white had that bishop on d3 and your kingside position, that could be dangerous. But without that bishop, white really cannot develop any attack. So for now, you can already be happy. But here's the trap I was talking about. At this point, you may come up with the move bishop b5, which cuts off white's king. It can't castle anymore. Now, it looks very strong at first. It looks very annoying for white, but that's what they're hoping for. Because it actually loses for black. So that's why I wanted to share this trap with you. They can play here, pawn a4, and you move your bishop back. Now they take here on c5, you do recapture, and here's the problem. They play pawn b4, attacking this bishop, and once it goes away somewhere, doesn't really matter, pawn b5 just wins this bishop. So that's the trap, a very sudden one, therefore even strong players got trapped like this sometimes, but if you do know it, it's very easy to get away from this. Let me go back a couple moves here. After white just played knight to f3, let's come back to this position. Here, instead of playing bishop b5, the simple solution is that if you do want to play that move, you just need to trade on d4 first, okay? And after that, you're good to go. So you trade there and you then play bishop b5. Now life's cool. They cannot trap your bishop anymore. These pawns aren't going anywhere. If they try, you'll capture it. And again, the position is approximately equal, but you have no problems whatsoever. It is rather white who has to be careful and try to fight for inequality. Okay, now let me show you one of the very common ways how you can outplay white playing normal moves and still you come out on top. If white plays the correct move knight to f3, which is the strongest move for white here, we still play queen b6, putting more pressure into this weak pawn. And bishop d3 is the correct move, putting the bishop on an active position, which potentially in the future can help white. And for now, we're ready to trade on d4, but we gotta be careful. We do know that we cannot take this pawn right away. If you do that, you fall into that trap that we've been talking about previously, bishop b5, check, and you lose the queen. We don't want to go here. Therefore, instead of that, let me just come back a couple moves. Here, instead of taking this pawn right away, we simply play bishop d3, bishop d7 first, preparing for this pawn to be captured. Now I need to do something about this. White may choose to sacrifice this pawn trying to get some compensation. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but some of your opponents will not be willing to do that, and they'll try something else. What can they do? If they try bishop e3, in fact, it's a very common blunder because it blunders this pawn on b2, and from there you're going to attack the rook, so that's completely bad for white. Bishop e3 is a common error. Another way is to drop the bishop back, enabling the queen to defend this pawn. And now we've got this common attacking move knight b4 that we've been talking about previously. Yes, it doesn't win the game on the spot, but initiating this exchange is actually a very good thing for you. And white cannot run away from this exchange. If they try something like bishop b3, then a very good thing that you can do is to bring your piece out over here, either bishop over here to b5 or queen over here to a6, which cuts off white's king and can't castle anymore. Moreover, on the next move, if they try whatever they want, this knight d3 check is extremely annoying. In fact, it simply wins the game because, you attack along this diagonal directly with your queen, so white doesn't want to put their king there. And if king goes to d2, it is ugly, and you take knight f2, hitting the queen, hitting the rook, so you just win. Since white can't save their bishop, they have to give it up, so they play something like castle, and now you happily grab the bishop. That's nice. Once this bishop is taken away, again, white can never really develop any significant attack against your king side, so you can already feel well about that. Now you can just develop something like rook c8, let's say getting a rook involved and attacking the queen, knight c3. Now we do need to develop our king side pieces, and one of the problematic pieces that you have is this knight, because we cannot develop it to a normal square. It will be captured by a pawn. So what do? Well, as we know, we usually then just simply change the route of the knight, and we develop it through e7. We develop knight e7, and after white plays something, bishop e3, this knight can go either to c6 and hit this pawn, or to f5 and hit this pawn equally well. Knight f5 is a pretty good square for the knight. It attacks this pawn, it potentially attacks the bishop, and is an active knight overall. White may be worried about this pawn on d4, as well as about this pin. So let's say they play something like queen d2. Now you develop your bishop also, and although right now it may look like the position is about equal, in fact, strategically, white's position is very difficult because you'll just keep attacking this pawn in the middle game. Let's say they play something, rook c1, you castle, and in the middle game, what you're going to do is to play rook c4, put more pressure onto this pawn, double rooks along the c-file, maybe play bishop b4, attacking this knight along this diagonal. So the point is, you can keep attacking along the c-file, you can put more pressure onto this pawn, you attack overall, and for white it is much harder to figure out any attacking plan. And that's how even experienced players playing white often goes down. Their position deteriorates gradually and you just win because they have nothing to do and you keep developing your attack. Okay, now we're approaching the main line, which will only occur if you're playing some really experienced and advanced level opponent. In this position, after you put pressure to this pawn, you're ready to capture it. We know that trying to hold on to this pawn with something like bishop c2 is actually a possible but a rather passive option of white. You can go after this bishop, take it away, and white is doomed for a passive position. Therefore, instead, sometimes white players will just sacrifice this pawn on d4 because they cannot defend it normally anyway, hoping to get some compensation. Let's say you take there on d4, now you're a pawn up, and they play knight c3. So their idea is just to take a leading development, and although they're a pawn down, they hope to develop some quick attack against your undeveloped position. And there are some tricks for white here. But the main rule that you gotta remember here is that you simply shouldn't be too greedy, and you shouldn't grab the other pawn on e5, because then you're really falling behind in development. You are playing just way too many moves with a single piece, with a queen, forgetting about the rest of your army and letting white attack. So we don't want to be greedy. And there is a very useful prophylactic move that you get to play here, pawn a6. If not, white has some tricks with knight b5 and some attacking ideas. But if you do know the right move, pawn a6, then you're basically securing yourself from any attacks of white, because if you just look at white's position, like, how can white really attack you? I mean, there aren't many good ways for white to do so. Also, your queen is putting pressure, right? If white moves the bishop away, you're happily trading queens, going into a winning endgame. You're still threatening this pawn on e5, and maybe they'll take it later. So white may be concerned about that. If I play something to defend this pawn on e5, let's say queen e2, then you just finish your development as usual. We do know that since knight doesn't go there in the French defense, you just change the route, we play knight e7, and from there, usually the knight goes either to f5 or to c6. In this particular position, knight f5 seems not so good because white can take it and destroy your pawn structure. Therefore, it is more likely that your knight will come here to c6 in the future. I mean, right on the next move, actually. We'll put more pressure onto the central pawn, and you're good to go, because, again, you're a pawn up, your position is fully secure after knight to c6. You can see that you're fully covered all around. Moreover, you hit this pawn. White cannot really play bishop e3. I mean, they can, but that'll lose this pawn on e5. right? Because that closes the queen's diagonal, so you'll just take the pawn, and why not? I mean, white can't attack you. D4 is coming at some point, right? So that's how you maintain your good position while saving your extra material. Okay, now we covered the main line, the advanced variation pawn to e5, and we're going to quickly cover the rest of the options for white, which are basically knight to c3 or pawn takes d5. And they're much easier for us to analyze, so it's not going to take much time. If pawn takes d5, that leads to an exchange variation, and there is no danger for you here. The position is just symmetric. Your bishop now is no longer locked there on c8, can be developed in the future. And basically you can play any normal development moves. They're all are equally good, but what I recommend is a more aggressive plan where you castle queenside. And so you do want to develop those queenside pieces first of all. So you play knight to c6, bringing the knight out. After white plays bishop d3, you play bishop g4, developing the bishop, putting this pin, and so indirectly, attacking this pawn on d4 as well. Let's say white goes pawn to c3, and you can go bishop d6. It's a usual square for the bishop in this variation, because we do know that white will castle probably on the next move, and our bishop takes an active part in our future attack. Now we can just play queen d7. We continue with our plan to castle queenside. We aren't scared of some potential checks along the e-file, because if they try that, you can easily cover your king knight to e7. Notice that we brought our bishop to d6 in advance, so that it's not locked on f8. And that gives you a very harmonious position with lots of attacking prospects for the middle game. If white ever tries bishop g5, again, we aren't scared of that at all. First of all, I mean, your knight is already defended, but you can just easily kick this bishop away, f6, bishop h4, and you castle queenside, so that is the setup that you want to achieve. And from here, you can go knight to f5, potentially in the future, and, attack this bishop on h4, or you can just start this pawn assault on the king side, pushing g5, pushing the h-pawn forward, starting your king side attack, and your position is good. Objectively, it should be about equal, but I'd say that it's actually easier to play it with black because you have some attacking ideas, and white's got to figure out how to deal with them. And the final two options, which in fact will lead to the same variation for us, are either knight to c3 or knight to d2. But in those both cases, however they develop their knight, I recommend that you trade here on a4. So we will reach the same position, which is easier for you. You don't need to learn two variations, you just learn one. And after knight takes e4, there's a very good variation which I recommend playing here. I have another video where I cover it in more details, so I do recommend that you check it out. And so you'll have like all-around knowledge about the French defense. And also, if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up and do subscribe to the channel for more like that, and I'll talk to you soon.